Okay, welcome to the last session of LXMLS. It's a big pleasure to have here Raquel Fernández from the European Commission's Joint Research Center and also the University of Amsterdam. So Raquel is famous for her work on discourse, dialogue, and multimodality. Today she's going to talk about multimodality. Her work has been funded by the ERC and also Dutch Research Council. So I'm very happy to have her. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you. Okay, great. So thanks a lot for inviting me to the school. I was telling Andre that several of my PhD students over the years have attended the school, but it is the first time that I actually come to the school, not to Lisbon, of course, but to the school. So it's my pleasure to be here. And also I'm honored to be giving this final talk. And I'm also honored to see many of you here still resisting. So thank you for being here. I understand that some of you maybe were not able to stay until the end, but it's great to see you. And so, yes, I will be talking about modeling human cognition, or more precisely, well, human language processing and in relation to multimodality. So these are topics that are not so much, well, you will judge yourself, but are maybe not so much in line to the things that mainly we discussed in the panel yesterday, which I also care very much about. But for today, I chose to talk about something different, which is much more like fundamental research, not so much related to societal impact, but focusing on fundamental research. And I decided, I work on several topics, and to mention some of them, but I decided to stick to multimodal because I thought that would be a good fit for the session, given how the lecture went this morning. And yeah, I'm very glad that what I saw of the lecture this morning, because I think it provides a good kind of background for this. But what I will be presenting is from a slightly different perspective, right? So as I said, my focus is not so much on the models themselves, but actually I think that this will provide a perspective that is different with respect to the research questions, right? And the research questions are more connected with trying to understand human language processing and multimodality in human cognition. And I hope that this will provide, hopefully, an interesting complement to the things that have already been presented in the school, and particularly this morning. All right. Okay, so I'm sure that this morning I missed part of the lecture, but I'm sure that the argument of visual grounding has already been made, maybe not even today, right? So the idea that our conceptual knowledge, our interaction with the world, the way in which we learn language is actually multimodal, right? So we are influenced by our perceptual activities and by how we interact with the world, and is a combination of all these things that actually builds our conceptual knowledge and how this knowledge ends up being encoded in language and used in many other ways, right? Language is also typically learned face-to-face, and when we are face-to-face, that brings in all the aspects concerned with multimodality, and I will be talking a bit more about this as well. Right? So this is very much part of human cognition and human language. And I'm interested in understanding a bit better how this works in humans concretely. Now, right. So the kind of questions that I'm interested in, or these are some of the questions I'm interested in, because I said I do different types of work. I also study LLMs and so on, but I want to focus on this today, right? So these are questions such as, for example, to what extent does human language processing interact with perception? I think we know that it does, but exactly the details of how this works is not well known. There is still tons of open questions and many things that are not fully known. And these are questions that cognitive scientists, computational linguists, etc., are still actively investigating, of course, right? And so how can we investigate these type of questions in an empirical way, and particularly using computational methods? And are deep learning methods, or the sort of AI models that we have been seeing in this school, machine learning models, the ones that we call AI nowadays models, suitable for this aim, for investigating these questions, and what kind of insights they can bring us? This is also a very open question, and I will present some of our work in this respect, but I am still puzzling over this myself. What are the real insights that we are getting? Right, so I think sometimes it's not so straightforward to get what the real insights are, but I still think that it's worth pursuing this and trying to see how far we can get with this kind of questions and with these kind of methods for addressing this kind of questions. So I plan, hopefully with the time that I have, to talk about two topics, two topics related to recent work that we have done. One concerns the modeling of co-speech gestures in face-to-face communication. And the other one goes more into looking at brain representations and at modeling multimodality. You will see exactly what I mean there in the brain, okay? I will, each of these topics, as you may imagine, could be a lecture or two in themselves. And I realized that these methods were not the focus of this school. So I will keep it at a rather high level. I hope that you will get the main insights. I will skip over many details, but yeah, as I said, I hope that you will still get a feeling for what it can mean to investigate these kind of questions and to look at these two type of topics. And perhaps some of you already know some of these, so that's fine. All right, so that's my goal. Hopefully, half and half, I'll be able to go over these two topics. So let's get started with the first part, which concerns the modeling of co-speech gestures in face-to-face communication. So as I was saying before, the primary form in which we use language and in which we learn it as in development as children is face-to-face. So of course, nowadays we use language in many ways, right? We write a lot of stuff, but face-to-face communication, typically spoken communication, is the most natural way in which we use language and the primary way in which we use language. And when we are in this communicative type of situation in face-to-face communication, and we talk about multimodality or vision and language, this has a slightly different meaning than what we typically think of when we think of vision language models, right? Where typically that means mixing images with text most often, right? So here by multimodality, I mean that we are exploiting like a rich range of signals in face-to-face communication, right? Not only the vocal modality, which will be the speech, but also lots of body signals, including, for example, our gaze. We can monitor the gaze of our interlocutor. Also, yeah, so the facial expressions and so on, and the gestures as well, the kind of gestures that we do without talking, which we do a lot. It's a bit culturally dependent and individually dependent, but it's very difficult to speak without gestures, actually. So all these signals are integrated when we are communicating with each other and when we are trying to exchange information with each other and do other things, collaborate, also establish rapport with each other and so on, which are important parts of communication. So among all these signals, I want to focus on gestures today. There are different types of gestures. According to cognitive scientists, for example, some gestures are considered emblems, and these would be very conventionalized things that can also be culturally dependent, of course, but things like these, right, that we can understand without speech, or like this, and so on. So these would be emblems. We also have pointing or deictic gestures, when I tell you, can you pass me that mic? And I use this gesture, pointing. There are also what are called beat or rhythmic gestures. These are more similar to the gestures that I have been doing now that don't exactly have a meaning, but they sort of punctuate a little bit also my prosody, and they mark a little bit the discourse structure and so on, these kinds of things. That I've been doing without thinking about. Now I'm paying attention to it, and now I don't know anymore how I'm moving, but before that, probably I was a bit more natural. And on top of that, we also have what's sometimes called iconic or representational, sometimes, co-speech gestures. And these are gestures that do occur concurrently with the speech. Some of the other types that I mentioned also sometimes occur with the speech, like pointing may occur or not with speech. But these iconic or representational gestures typically occur concurrently with the speech, and they tend to carry a bit more semantic, pragmatic meaning. Right? And they are often used in sort of referential situations, and we may use them, so they are iconic or representational because the form of the gesture somehow refers, has some connection, some iconic connection with what the gesture means, right? And I could tell you something like, can you pass me the mic? And by this, I mean that one that is over, now I'm pointing, but you see what I mean. The mic that is like this and not this one that is like this, right? So I can use gestures that are a bit representational and that carry this pragmatic and or semantic meaning by representing what they are talking about. And I am speaking on top of that, also providing hopefully what we think is complementary information to what we are saying. So I'm going to be focusing on these iconic representational gestures. And in particular, our interest in the work that I will present is on learning representations for these gestures, for this type of gestures in particular, okay? So by this, I mean we want to learn gesture embeddings, like representations for these representational gestures. Now, I always put this slide on why do we want to learn gesture embeddings, because I've presented this type of work to different type of audiences. So this is a collaboration with cognitive scientists, but I've presented this to linguists, to cognitive science, also to more computational people and so on. And everybody has slightly different ideas of whether this question makes sense at all, whether it's just a rhetorical question, because obviously we want to learn gesture embeddings, we want to do the embeddings of everything, so gestures as well. So, but I think it's worth to think about why we may want to learn these kind of things and why it might be useful. So traditionally in gesture studies, which is typically a field within cognitive science, gestures are studied by first being coded manually, right? So you have people coming into the lab, they perform some task where gestures are important, then you record them, and then typically you would go and manually annotate these gestures, and that would give you some information that then you can study. You can maybe use some statistical analysis, or you can just quantify or analyze what properties the gestures have simply by annotation. So a lot of the work is manually done, right? So there is some need, in my view, or it can be beneficial to have more data-driven methods that can give us more quantitative tools for analyzing gestures, for example. Right? So I think that this is one of the reasons. And of course, if we have something like embeddings for a gesture, then we have a representation that allows certain types of operations, right? Like, for example, we can compute similarity between these representations, which is something that is very difficult to do if you have like symbolic manual type of annotation, or at least you get a different type of similarity. And similarity is something that is particularly interesting for gestures because I will not go into this, but there is a lot of interesting questions that have to do with the extent to which speakers align in how they use gestures, like to what extent they mimic each other and to what extent this mimicking of each other's behaviors actually is related to establishing mutual understanding. So having a notion of similarity between gestures as well as other communicative signals can be actually pretty useful, right? So this is, so the goal is to have some tool that allow us to extract properties of gestures at a more larger scale and to do studies that are quantitative and empirical at a larger scale. Obviously, once you have proper methods, this can also be helpful for applications that involve gestures, like embodied language understanding or even gesture generation. So yeah, there are other motivations as well. For the work that I will present here, we don't have an application in mind, right? So we are just interested in learning gesture representations in an unsupervised way, with the hope that these representations will encode properties of gestures that make intuitive sense or that are in line with theoretical approaches to gestures. Okay, and we don't have a particular application in mind. That's a bit the point. So it's a bit like a starting point, if you want, of a research program. And so for learning these representations of gestures, we are going to use two types of input. On the one hand, we will consider only unimodal input. That means we will learn gesture embeddings by looking only at motion, at body motion. By using skeleton models, like models of body joints, right? And on the other hand, we will aim to learn the embeddings by enriching this motion information with information that comes from the vocal stream. So sort of grounding gestures in the concurrent speech. And why do we do this? Because there are theories of gestures that consider gestures as properly multimodal events. So it's a bit more a sort of like Gestalt type of view of what gestures are as holistic acts that are multimodal in themselves. So we are going to try to come up with a way of using the different types of modalities for having representations of gestures. So these are the two types of input that we are exploring in this type of work. The data set that we are going to use, that we are using for this work, is a data set that was collected by some colleagues in the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen some years ago. It's of course a small data set by any machine learning standards, but rather substantial by cognitive science standards. So this is a data set collected in the lab, where you have two participants that are doing a referential task. This means they have to identify for each other some objects. So here they have these like weird looking objects. This is the pointer, right? So these objects, they are, I'm showing this here, but this is not seen by the speakers, right? So they have the objects represented here in the screen. The objects are like non-conventional. There are no names. Therefore, it's a bit difficult for them to figure out how to refer to them because they don't have conventional names. And one of them sees them here, and there is a target, and the person has to identify, well, this one is probably describing in this case, has to describe it, and the other one has to identify it. There are 16 objects. This is a very well-known paradigm, this kind of referential tasks. This is a paradigm used often for investigating dialogue interaction. Right? So this is the task, and the speakers are not instructed about whether to use gestures or not, or how to talk, or anything like that. They are just instructed about what the task is, what the goal is, and they are free to communicate as they like. But it's a type of task that elicits a lot of gestures, and particularly representational gestures, because of the nature of the task. Right? So gestures that tend to help, well, hopefully to help in letting the addressee identify the object that is the referent. So the data is in Dutch, right? So this is collected in the Netherlands, and the data is in Dutch. This is by Dutch native speakers. The data set has two parts. So one larger part that mostly has raw data, and a smaller part that has been very carefully curated and that has been manually transcribed, where the gestures have been manually segmented. They have several annotations. I will tell you a bit more about the relevant ones later on. And this corresponds to 19 dialogues and roughly 5,000 gestures. And then there is the larger part of the data set that were simply, there was no time and resources to annotate. So this is the raw videos, and we have done some processing of these videos by automatically transcribing the speech in the dialogues, also automatically identifying gestures with an approach that we developed a couple of years ago. Yeah, automatic transcription, automatic gesture, segmentation, and also some oversampling to have even more data, right? And the idea of these different sections of the data set is that we plan to use the larger, more noisy data set for learning our representations, and then the curated data set with the nice manual annotations for evaluating and trying to understand what is it that we have learned with our proposed representation learning approach. All right, so the data looks a little bit like this. So there are the videos, there is the speech, and there is also the transcription, right? And we start from previously, as I mentioned, segmented gestures. So we have the gesture, we extract the part of the video centered, 1 second of the video centered on the gesture stroke, which is the part of the gesture that tends to carry the most of the meaning. There are several phases of a gesture, but the stroke is the one that carries most of the meaning. So 1 second, we extract the video, 1 second center on the annotation of the gesture. And then from the vocal part, we extract 2 seconds also centered on the same point from the speech. Why do we do this? Because typically there is some asynchrony between the moment where we produce the gesture and when we will say something that is related to the gesture. I mean, we may or may not say something related to the gesture, right? But just to account for this possible asynchrony, we just take a longer section from the vocal modality. right? This has all been empirically tested, and this is, of course, a bit arbitrary, but it has some empirical motivation. So we have, therefore, these three tiers. From the video, we extract the body joints, the skeleton. So we're not using directly the raw pixels, the raw images, but we just first preprocess the data to extract the body joints with an existing model. And then we have the speech and also also the text, the transcription, right? And we use pre-trained models to encode each of these modalities. So you see a little bit what we are using here. So yeah, you can see that this might not be the most, the latest type of models. You can try to use other models as well. These were the ones that we were using at the time, also for the type of data that we have. So embeddings extracted with the Dutch BERT, wave to back to have speech embeddings. And then for the kinematics, for the body movements, we are using this dual stream spatiotemporal transformer motion encoder, which I'll show you in a moment what this is architecture, which is then the core that we use and adapt to try to learn the gestures embeddings and to ground them on speech. Okay, so these are pre-trained models that we use initially to encode the modalities that are available. And then now we are going to use some of these modalities in one architecture and some in some other architecture. So as I mentioned, the first type of input that we experimented with is simply corresponding to motion, to kinematics, without any grounding on speech. And so this is task agnostic, right? So we want to use some sort of unsupervised learning. And what we do here is something very similar to the CLIP architecture that was mentioned this morning, right? So you remember the CLIP architecture with the contrastive learning and so on. So this is essentially what we are applying here. So we take as a starting point this motion encoder, right? Which has two branches, one for spatial self-attention, right, that tries to model the different body joints that are connected at a given moment in time, and another branch with a temporal self-attention will stretch to model, given a body joint, the progression over time of that body joint. Okay. So this is the core that was already there. Now we add a contrastive loss, a contrastive objective, by augmenting the data, similarly also to things that Desmond was explaining this morning. So we augment the data by modifying, by maybe flipping and doing other types of transformation to the initial video and to the body joints, so that we can have positive pairs for samples that belong to the same gesture and negative pairs for samples that do not belong to the same gesture. Right? So we add this contrastive loss, and we also complement it with a mask reconstruction loss, where we are masking some of the joints, and then we train the model to reconstruct them. And then these two losses are optimized jointly. Right? But all that we are doing here is using only information from the body movements and the body motions. Now, the alternative is to enrich this further, but also by also including information that comes from the vocal modality, from what is being said concurrently to when the gesture is happening. Then we end up with something that is more multimodal. And again, we employed contrastive learning. Right? So we have our architecture from before. And now we have the encoder for the vocal modality, which can either take speech, or it can take text. So we don't combine the two of them. We do one or the other. So when I mean semantic here, I mean like text embeddings, embeddings based on text. And so there is some integration in the middle with some cross attention that fuses things midway, and then another contrastive loss that tries to bring the concurrent speech and the gesture happening at the same time closer together in space. Okay, so I think the type of methods are very similar to some things that we have seen before, and they are a bit adapted to this problem. Okay, all right. So we have these two architectures, unimodal and this multimodal architecture where the gestures are grounded on speech. And so we use the bigger portion of the data set to do this training. We end up with some gesture embeddings. And now the question is, okay, this maybe makes some sense. I'm sure that there can be other sorts of improvements that we can do. But now our question is, what properties do these embeddings have? Did we manage to learn anything that actually makes any sense, that is really in accordance to how we would expect that gestures behave, or what we want to have in a gesture representation, right? So we really didn't know much about what to expect, given that it's not something very, very sophisticated, right? So let's see what kind of properties we find here. So first, we are going to look at very simple, like similarity patterns. Given that we have the embeddings and that one of the things that this affords is calculating similarity, we can just look at similarity patterns and see whether these patterns are in accordance with intuitions that come from theoretical, well, assumptions or discoveries before. So the first, I hope that you can see a little bit the photo. So one hypothesis that we can consider is something rather obvious, right? We are dealing with representational or iconic gestures. So given that these gestures are iconic and a representation, then it seems meaningful, it seems sensible to assume that gestures that have the same referent will be more similar than gestures that refer to different objects, right? So luckily, the small curated version of the data set is annotated with the referent for each gesture. So we can check whether this is the case, whether there is higher similarity for same referent gestures. Right, so the similarity measures that I'm showing you here were the ones obtained with the multimodal gesture architecture, but actually all the patterns also hold for the unimodal architecture. So basically, I'm just showing you these ones, but they, for now, they hold for the two of them. Okay, so yeah, so we see that, I mean, the absolute values of similarity are not very important here. What matters is the relative distance. So we see that indeed, when two gestures are referring to the same object, then the embeddings for those gestures are more similar than if they are referring to different objects. So far, so good. Another hypothesis concerns individual differences. So it's also well known that people have a certain, let's say, style in how they gesture, that there are certain individual tendencies. So therefore, it seems sensible to expect that if two gestures come from the same individual, then they will be more similar to each other than if they come from different individuals. All right? And we also find that that this is respected in the kind of semantic space that we are, well, vector space that we are obtaining with the vector representations. Now, the third hypothesis may be a little bit more controversial. Let's say that it is more, the two previous ones were very common sense, right? The third one is a little bit more theoretically loaded, and it has to do with what I briefly mentioned before about the fact that it seems that people do entrain with each other when they are interacting, that we try to mimic each other's behavior. So therefore, we could expect that if participants do entrain in interaction, that is, they get influenced by what the other is doing, and we try to sort of mimic each other a little bit. If that is the case, then gestures that refer to the same referent by two speakers that have interacted together in the same dialogue will be more similar to each other than if we take gestures that do refer to the same referent, but actually come from different dialogues where the participants did not interact with each other. Okay? Hope that this is clear. And what we get is, well, I mean, it is actually, the difference is very small. The difference is still significant, but I would not put a lot of weight on this. So we do get a pattern that goes in the right direction, which is already quite something. I really didn't expect this, but obviously this has to be replicated. The previous results obviously also have to be replicated many times, I hope, right? But this has to be replicated, and it's something that we have already started to do with a different data set. And we are getting in this replication results that go also in this direction. So that's actually pretty nice. So we are trying to replicate it with a data set that is not face-to-face, but it's this communication that is computer mediated. Think of having an interaction via Zoom, for example. And in this Zoom interaction, There are two conditions, one where speakers do see each other via Zoom, and another one where they also only hearing each other, as if you were on the phone, right? And what we see is that when you see each other, even though you may see each other a bit cropped and so on, that the same patterns do happen. But when there is only audio and no video, then you don't get this kind of entrainment effect, right? Then it is not the case that the gestures by speakers that were in the same dialogue are more similar to the gestures by speakers that were in different dialogues, right? Meaning that it looks like this possible similarity is driven simply by being able to see each other and to kind of entrain through this kind of visual feedback, right? I mean, I think this is pretty interesting because it's not that, well, there are many things that we could say here, right? But so even if we don't see each other, we tend to gesture as well, maybe in different ways and less, right? But when we are on the phone, we also tend to gesture, right? So this brings lots of interesting questions, like what is is there an intention behind the gesture or not? Is there a communicative intention behind the gesture? Is the gesture intended to actually help the addressee recover a meaning? Or not necessarily, because if we also use these gestures when actually our interlocutor doesn't see us, then the story is not as simple, right? It could be that the gestures are also helping the speaker themselves to produce something. So just to mention that it's not trivial that we see these patterns, and exactly what is the information that is important in gestures and how this interacts with language is actually an important open question. Okay. All right, I'm very late now. Okay, well, just a couple of more things. So in the idea of trying to figure out a little bit more what these representations are targeting, another aspect that we can check is whether we can recover some properties from the gesture embeddings. Like, for example, the dataset includes some annotations on which pairs of gestures were similar with respect to some manually coded features. For example, whether the gestures were similar with respect to their shape, right? Whether the gestures were similar with respect to handedness, which means whether speakers were using one single hand or the two hands to do the gesture. These ones are using two hands. So these are properties that are coded, and you see there on the right-hand side the distribution of how many of these features were shared between the gestures. So very few gesture pairs are similar with respect to all features, but some pairs are similar with respect to some features. So this is manually coded. So we want to try to check whether we can recover some of this information from the embeddings, right? So in this case, we are, again, just looking at correlations first. And what we see here is that there is a positive correlation between the similarity of the gesture embeddings and the amount of manually coded features that were provided by annotators, right? And here the difference is actually, there is a difference between the multimodal, the gestures learned with the multimodal architecture and the gestures were learned with the unimodal architecture. And the ones learned with the multimodal architecture do correlate more strongly with these form features, which I think it is quite interesting because these features are very physical, right? But if you learn your embeddings grounding them in speech, then actually you get representations that apparently are more robust or that are more in accordance with the expectations that we would have, right? We also use some probing classifiers here to try to see whether we can recover these properties that were manually represented, and we do, right? So we have simple classifiers for each of the properties, and we do obtain the accuracy of these classifiers is above chance, given a baseline that operates on random embeddings. So it looks like these properties are to some extent encoded into the embeddings, not all of them to the same extent. And the patterns that we obtained here can in fact also help in designing more, in formulating more research questions that could be answered perhaps with empirical research. I know that I'm not giving you enough details to understand all this, but okay, hopefully, if you're interested, you can go to the papers and perhaps understand it a bit better. So just to finish with this topic here, finally, another aspect that we investigate from the gesture embeddings that we learn is whether we can recover which is the referent that was meant by the gesture, right? So we have our gesture embeddings. Can we extract which reference was being meant? Can we do a bit of reference resolution? This is also a probing experiment, right? So we are not trying to devise a proper system for reference resolution. We are just probing whether this information is part of the embeddings. Okay, so this is again a simple classifier that tries to identify the referent. There are many possible reference because there are only 16 objects, but actually the reference are rather the parts of the objects because this is what the gestures tend to refer to. And this is a summary of the results that I think I should not really go over them because it's a bit too much. But basically, so the baseline would be very, very low, like 0.02 or 0.03% when we have random embeddings. So we can see that we can predict the referent well above chance, not with very high accuracy, but well above chance. So that information is somewhat actually present there, even though the reference were not part of the information included in the pre-training phase, in the representation learning phase. Right, but yeah, basically some of the patterns that we see here is that this information is more properly present when we learn the embeddings with the multimodal architecture. And then I didn't explain you this, but we can do a very simple experiment where we just concatenate the gesture embedding with the embedding of the vocal modality at inference time, right? And this seems to indicate that there is some complementarity between these two types of information, right? So the gesture by itself does carry some information, and this information is not simply redundant to what we are being said, but apparently complementary. Okay, I hope that you got a little bit the gist. I know that I was going very fast at the end and that all these things maybe didn't manage to convey all the significance of all these aspects, but I hope that at least I put these ideas in your head and that you can go and look at the paper if you're interested. All right, so yeah, it looks like we can learn embeddings that are in accordance with expectations that would make sense, that have some of the properties that we would like these embeddings to have. There are tons of open questions, obviously, and many other ways in which this could be done. For instance, this was a data set that is really small for a particular task in a particular language. So whether this generalizes is something that remains an open question. But as I said, our starting point are segmented gestures and particularly the body joints. This could be done in different ways, right? We could start from having more the continuous video and maybe using directly the visual data rather than the body joints, possibly. And different aspects as well. So for example, we could also learn the embeddings by grounding them in properties of the reference, right? That's another idea, which goes actually very much in line to how the idea behind training behind visual grounding, right? So here we have different types of grounding: the speech, the body movements, and the reference, right? The external world. Okay. Now's when I'm supposed to move to the second part, but I only have 15 minutes left. So the pruning was not as well done as I was hoping. All right, so what I tried to present you up to now was concerned with looking at behavior, right? So gestures are part of our behavior. We can perceive this behavior, etc., when we are interacting face to face. But I think that it's also interesting to try to look at more internal representations of how our brain actually may be processing language and other input. And this is more at the individual level, of course, right? Before I was more concerned with the communication face to face. When we are looking at brains, for now at least, we are more concerned with the individual processing, and it's interesting to try to figure out whether we can understand what type of representations are being created internally in the brain when language and other types of modalities are being processed. And so there are different methods that can be used for recording these representations, different types of brain imaging, like recording like electrical activity, and also like blood flows in the brain. And the work that I want to talk about here today has to do, uses fMRI data for recording brain activations. And essentially, this type of data is collected in an fMRI scanner, so a scanner that records the flows of blood activation in the brain, in certain regions of the brain, given a certain stimulus to a participant that is in the scanner. Then the scanner records these activations in different regions of the brain that are called voxels, right? So the voxels will be just very tiny cubes in our brain where the scanner will record the blood activation, and this will give us a map of activations. All the voxels will give rise to a map of activations that are elicited in response to a given stimulus. And the stimulus can be, for example, a sentence or an image or any other type of stimulus that we are interested in, right? And the point is that this activation map that we get out of the scanner can be represented as a vector, and then we can try to interpret what these vectors actually encode, right? I'm not being very fluent at the moment, but I hope that you get the idea, right? So this is what we get out of the scanner. Now, the question is, what kind of information is being encoded in this kind of, in these brain representations that we obtain? There are different methodologies that have been used for trying to get some understanding of what's the information encoded in brain representations that we can obtain from fMRI scanners. And so recently, in the last few years, actually not so recent, but in the last few years, so computational neuroscientists have become more interested in using deep learning models, AI models, language models, vision and language models to try to understand what is in these representations. Okay, so this is a field that sometimes is referred to as neuro AI, and it concerns the use of models to try of deep learning models to try to understand what's in this type of representation. Two of the most common methods being used for this are representational similarity analysis and also encoding models. In both cases, what we do is to input the same stimuli that is given to the participants that are being scanned into the models and obtaining representations for those stimuli, right? And then once we have the representations for the stimuli, then we can sort of compare these to the representations that we obtain from the participants. In representational similarity analysis, what we see is to compare whether the geometrical structure of the two spaces is similar, to compute to what extent the geometrical structure is similar. And in encoding models, on the other hand, what we do is to train models to predict, to use the model embeddings to predict the brain activations. Right? And typically these are models that we train per voxel. So for each of the voxels, we train a model that will aim to predict the blood activation that we see in that voxel. Right, so we train these are rich regression models that are trained voxel-wise, and then what we report is the correlation between the predicted activations and the observed activations. Right? And of course, there are different types of tests that are to measure significance. There are different types of tests that we do by doing multiple permutations and calculating how often what is the likelihood that this correlation here is actually above what we obtain with randomized input. Okay. All right. So these are two of the most common methods. Now, what are some of the questions that we could investigate with this type of toolkits? There is a variety of questions, but one of the questions that my group and other people out there have been investigating concerns multimodality and could be formulated as something like that. So to what extent, so is it the case that vision and language models better capture human concept understanding that language-only models, right? So if we buy the idea of visual grounding, and we have powerful enough vision language models, then we may be able to see that the representations learned by vision language models are better aligned with human concept representations. So this is one of the possible questions that you can investigate. You can see here 2 papers where we have investigated this question. Other people, as I said, have investigated this as well. I'm not going to give you the details of this. I just wanted to put it here. Just wanted to mention that the results that we get are quite mixed, right? So they are not always, so for instance, in this paper here, we basically obtain negative results where we see that visually grounded representations don't provide an advantage when it comes to brain alignment. And in this paper here, we actually get a positive result, well, call it positive or not, so that we see that there is more alignment with vision and language models. It's not so surprising, right? Because this uses different type of data. We are using different type of models. The stimuli are different. In one case, the stimuli are contextualized. In the other case, they are given as single words, right? So it's not surprising that there are differences. And one of the challenges is actually how to set up experiments that are sufficiently controlled so that you can actually get conclusions that you can trust. But I think that there is still that it is still quite interesting to look into this, but you have to be careful with what we get. Without going into the details of this study, I just wanted to mention, just because some of the models that we use were mentioned this morning. They are, again, not the most advanced models, but for example, this is for the study that you see here. So these are some of the models that we use. And for instance, in this case, what we saw is that the sort of older initial VLM encoders are the ones that tend to give higher alignment with brain representations, right? And in general, autoregressive model, generative models are not the ones that are typically more brain aligned, right? So, I mean, that's okay. So there is no need to expect that the more powerful models that perform better in certain tasks are the ones that will be more brain aligned. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And think about the fact that here, I didn't give you a lot of information or any information about the tasks, but we are not dealing with people generating language. It's more about concept understanding, right? So people are presented with a stimulus. They are not generating anything. So this may also be a reason why generative models are not the ones that are most aligned, okay? So it's other simpler models that are more that are optimized not for next word prediction or for generation that actually lead better productivity in this case. And well, I mean, I could say many things here of on the significance of these aspects, because I think that it is difficult to disentangle whether the results that we get from these types of analysis tell us something about the AI models themselves or about what the brain is encoding, right? So I do realize that it's difficult to tease these things apart. And this is, after all, a very kind of young field where I think that we are still working out what is the best methodology and what we can extract from this methodology. Now, in the final part, I want to mention a study that has to do with brain activation, of course, but that is a little bit different. This is not yet published, so yeah, I will not go into a lot of detail. But these papers that I just mentioned before mostly are focusing on modeling brain activation in language processing areas in the brain that have an activation that has been elicited by presented visual stimuli, right? And we try to model this with embeddings that are visually grounded, okay? The stimuli is linguistic, And we try to model it with visually grounded embeddings, as opposed to language-only learned embeddings, okay? Now, the next study that I want to mention goes a little bit the other way around. In this case, we are interested in modeling brain activation in visual processing areas in the brain. So visual areas that are specialized in processing visual input. And we want to see whether we can, to what extent we can model these activations by using AI model representations that are linguistic. Okay, so it's the other way around. I find this quite fascinating, actually. So why are we doing this? So there has been some recent work that has shown that embeddings coming from captions, from image descriptions, from image captions, actually can be rather predictive of the type of activity that, that we find in high-level visual processing areas. Right? When I say high level, I mean areas that are not just concerned with discriminating light or texture or something like this, but that are what typically neuroscientists call high level processing areas. Right? So there is a variety of work showing that, yes, that information that comes from language, when you are showing people stuff that has nothing to do with language, just visual, and that activates part of the visual cortex, actually are good predictors of these brain representations. Okay, so why do you think that this can be? In fact, it's maybe not very mysterious, but I think that this is still quite interesting. Right? So yeah, so it's not so mysterious, I think, but still interesting. Right? So basically, the idea is that these high-level visual processing areas are processing visual stimuli, but the information, at least that's the theory, the information that they represent in our brain is more semantic, right? So it's kind of extracting semantic information from low-level visual processing, all right? Now, the information that apparently our language models learn from language, at some point, presumably, maybe it's also more abstract semantic information that is a bit modality independent, if you want. So that's presumably where the connection can be made, right? So it's as if we are extracting similar semantic information that in the end is a bit modality independent, and you can establish a connection regardless of where the input came from. That's a little bit the idea. So of course, we don't know whether this is the case, right? So in a way, the research is about checking whether caption embeddings can model visual activity to make the point that the representations that are in our brain in this visual cortex are semantic representations, right? Okay, so there's this work, but there is still a lot of open questions related to that, of course. So we try to dig a little bit into this aspect in our recent work. So what we have been doing is creating more varied language captions to try to figure out a little bit what are the properties of these captions that actually make them predictive of the information that the brain is processing in the visual cortex, in the higher level visual cortex. Right? And all the experiments up to now have used just the captions that are present in the MS-COCO data set, which are human-produced captions, crowdsourced human-produced captions that have been around for a long time. So what we are doing here is to generate further captions automatically using vision language models by giving them the same stimuli that the people were giving in the past, and just generating other types of additional captions. It's not so important that they are automatically generated. It's just to generate other type of captions and have more variety and see what we can get with this. And then, of course, we need to embed these captions with different embedders that are language-only embedders. That they are not multimodal, not vision and language-only embedders. So we prompt this is the caption generation part. We prompt the model, we embed this model, and we end up with a caption embedding that we are going to use into a brain encoding model to predict the brain activations in the visual cortex. just to give you an idea of how these captions look like, you see here at the top for this image, the original Coco caption, and then the captions that were generated by the different VLMs that we are using. The prompts, of course, are in our preprint. And you can see that the models can be a bit different. They tend to be more verbose than humans, particularly Molmo, like we saw also this morning, how Molmo had been trained. So Molmo tends to be very verbose. And you, here in this table, you see a little bit the statistics of these different caption types generated by models and by humans in terms of the length. So in brackets, you have the standard deviation. In terms of the length of the captions, visualness corresponds to some ratings provided manually that exist in some existing norms. So this is a sort of visualness score of the captions, and you see also some significant differences here. This is lexical density in terms of the amount, the percentage of content words in the caption. So there are some differences, right? So we want to see how the embeddings for these different types of captions account for the brain activations in the visual cortex. The data here, the fMRI data, the brain data comes from an existing data set where participants were faced with these images that come from the MS-COCO data set. And they didn't have to generate anything. They just had to press a button if they had seen the image or not before, right? So it was just for them to pay attention to the images, not more than this. All right, just some information on the scanner. And then, so we consider activity maps that come from 3 different high-level visual areas that are known to be specialized for recognizing faces, for recognizing places, and for recognizing bodies, right? By previous work, this is mapped. The areas are roughly known. There is, of course, a lot of individual variation in brains, but all this is accounted for in the way in which this data set is collected. So we distinguish these parts. You can see already that there is important semantic information, right? So if there are areas that are specialized in recognizing faces, this is already an important type of abstraction that is more semantic and not so much low level. So yeah, high level of the results that we obtain here. So basically, you can see here the plots corresponding to the different models used for generating the captions, including the humanly produced COCO captions. And then these are the models used to embed the captions. The embeddings are what we use in the encoding models then. And just for comparison, this is the predictivity, and what this is recording is the correlation, right? So the correlation with between observed and predicted activations. And just for comparison, this is giving you what you would obtain if instead of the caption embeddings, you would use the image features, right? So the images is what the participants actually see. So of course you expect that the image features will have some level of predictivity, right? And they do. But if you just eyeball this, you see that the captions actually have very similar predictivity to what the visual features actually give you, right? So it's really very similar. So basically this is a confirmation, is one more replication of the fact that caption embeddings do predict brain activation in the visual cortex. Then like digging a little bit farther into the types of captions and the types of embeddings. Yeah, so what we see by using linear mixed models is that the original COCO captions are the ones that are the least predictive, not because they are humanly generated, I don't think that that's the point, but just because probably they tend to be shorter, and we have seen before that they also are less visual, right, in terms of those ratings, and less dense in terms of content words and so on. So they have several features that make them less predictive. So actually, the machine-generated captions with the prompts that we have used to generate it give rise to captions that in fact are more predictive, right? But more than the surface level features of these captions, what matters is the language model used to embed these captions. This has more of an impact on the level of predictivity that we obtain for modeling brain activations. Right, so the embedding model really matters quite a lot, and it remains to be seen what properties of these embedding models are the most predictive. There is not a single embedding model that is most predictive for all these regions, for bodies, places, and so on. They vary, but what is certainly the case is that models train for embedding models, so not generative models, are better suited for these tasks, right? So models train like embedding models that maybe have been trained for retrieval, for image retrieval, and so on, are better suited than generative models. Okay, now I just want to finish. Don't worry, I'm almost finishing. Just want to mention very briefly that this analysis is also performed layer-wise, so it's quite interesting as well to try to see. Well, there are many more experiments in the paper, but so it is interesting to try to see what information in these caption embeddings might be the one that is more that leads more brain predictivity. And one of the experiments that we look is to estimate the intrinsic dimensionality per layer, right? Inspired by this paper. I'm not sure whether you can see this very much, but this paper. Yeah, this comes, well, at least one of the authors is Marco Baroni and colleagues, which is a very interesting paper, which show that that there is a certain peak in intrinsic dimensionality. So the intrinsic dimensionality would be the amount of dimensions that the model is using to actually encode most of the information, right? So and that is a certain peak in this intrinsic dimensionality that corresponds with the layers in the model that contain information that is more important for downstream tasks that concern abstract semantics and syntax. Okay, and what we see in our experiments here, we plot intrinsic dimensionality of some of the embeddings together with brain predictivity, that there seems to be a relationship between this intrinsic dimensionality and the amount of brain predictivity. That goes in line with what I have been repeating, that after the peak of intrinsic dimensionality, which appears to be the moment when abstract information is more present and is better suited for other downstream tasks, that's also when we obtain the best model predictivity, right? Which would be in line with the idea that the visual cortex in the parts where we are investigating is computing abstract semantic information. Okay. All right, I'm finishing. So this is an interim summary, more or less, of the things that I've mentioned. There are many more things in the preprint. As I said, this is not yet published, but I'm just gonna go to wrapping up. I started by mentioning some generic questions that I'm interested in, and I try to give you two examples of two streams of work, one concerned with speech gestures in face-to-face interaction, the other one looking more at information in the brain. I have my doubts that I managed to convey most of the things that I wanted to convey, but in any case, I hope that at the very least I put this type of research in your radar, and that you may want to look at it if you are interested. So for me, some of the takeaway messages are that why am I excited about this? Because I think that these two topics in particular are topics that are very difficult, and that up to now we really had hardly any tools that we could use to investigate these topics in a kind of data-driven way and computational way. The tools that we have at the moment maybe are not perfect, and as I said, we have to fine-tune this methodology at all and a lot, and we have to also be very, very careful with the conclusions that we get, right? I try to not make any big claims because I think, as I said, we need a lot of replication of this. But it's still quite amazing that we can now tackle these difficult problems like face-to-face interaction and brain activations, that we can start to look into them, right? And just to mention that I consider this just a complementary tool to other types of research methodologies that are more experimental with the studies in the lab and that are also about theory building, that actually can give us pointers for what to test with this type of methods. All right. Okay. Just thanks to the people that have contributed to this work. I hope that here are most of them, and these are also most of the papers that I think, all of the papers that I tried to mention. Thanks also for your attention, and apologies for the rumbling a little bit. Thanks.
Hi. On the gesture work, is it obvious that a learned embedding is better than the very naive approach? I mean, you could imagine placing a few points, say 10 points throughout your arm. Each point would have, 3 coordinates. So in 30 numbers, you can describe more or less the position. If you want some time, you could add 10 time frames. Which, I mean, I'm sure it's very, very naive, but it would be an almost complete description of a gesture. It would be kind of fully transparent, right? Like, you could go back and forth.
Right. Well, I think that it's a good intuition. The question on whether is it better, we would need to define this question a bit better, right? Because is it better for what? I think it depends. Depending on the kind of investigations that you want to do, that might be sufficient and what you want, right? For instance, one of the things that was driving our research here was to also try to learn gestures multimodally. I think I didn't manage to make that point very well, but to do this learning with information that comes from different sources, right? Like grounding the body movements into concurrent speech. Like, so what you are describing is just circumscribed to the kinematics, the body movements themselves, right? So you could say, okay, with that approach, which might be sufficient depending on what you want to do, so you could calculate similarity with that. So fine, fair enough, right? Right, you cannot easily extend it to this grounding in speech. So that could be an aspect where that's not sufficient, for example.
Thank you.
I also want to.
Hi. Sorry, here. Yeah, so about the gestures work as well.
Yep.
When you were learning the representations for the gestures in the embedding space, how do you know the size of the embedding space that it is required? So how many dimensions do you actually need to represent these gestures in the embedding space?
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't think that we experimented like systematically with different dimensionalities, but that is one parameter that you could investigate, right? Like what having some targets and then testing. Oh, yeah, I mean, this is a parameter that you could experiment with. So so basically you don't know a priori what's the optimal dimensionality of the embeddings. And if I recall correctly, it's already a couple of years ago, but I don't think that we systematically tested different values for this. But it could be an interesting question to figure out what's an optimal dimensionality.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for the work. I come from cognitive science, so this is very interesting. I was just wondering, all the participants were adults in this work, or was there any developmental, I guess, studies in that sense? Yeah.
Right. No, in all the work that I presented, they were all adults. There was no developmental. I mean, that would be, that would be amazing. Also because the development of gestures is also a very interesting topic. So that would be amazing. For the brain alignment, it is a huge challenge to keep children in the scanner. I know people that are trying to do it, but it's really, really difficult because they have to be still, and that's almost impossible.
Yeah, because I saw some research from Meta that they use the children with the implanted electrodes because of health reasons. And it could be interesting to, I guess, apply this to that kind of data and see what comes out. because there's like the interaction when children are learning to speak, right? They have an interaction also between the shape of the objects and the size of the words. So it could be interesting to
Yeah.
see how that plays out with gestures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like language acquisition, like multimodal language
Exactly.
acquisition, that would be fantastic. And now that you mentioned Meta, I think this is a good thing. So we are seeing a lot more interest in embodied communication, right? And trying to model embodied communication. And Meta precisely is investing quite a lot of resources and research on this, and has released some data sets of videos and body tracks that really show that there is interest, and that now is the moment where we can address this type of questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank the speaker again.
Yes, you will find it, no? Your side.
Sorry, please. Hi. Okay, so I'm going to have to turn my face. So this turns the pages like this. Okay, it does. Okay, so bear with me. We do it every year. It's always a bit of an improv. So because you realize you answered this just the last minute, then we did all these things, then Bruno and Fernando prepared these stats. I basically eyeball them and then I just speed run through them and try to invent something on the fly. So bear with me, we're almost done. Okay, so we started this in 2011. So it's been like 16 years, depending on how you count. So really, at the time, we always have people from around the world. I think lately, maybe since COVID, there's a bit more people from Europe. We always track things like, like we wanted this to be as homogeneous as possible. We're still not fully happy with the participation in terms of female-male ratio, but I think things in general are improving in that area. This year, I think we had less people from industry. There's these weird trends where we got a lot of applications, but not that many registered in this. I think that we started 16 years ago. There were no other summer schools practically, and now there's like a gazillion of them, and this makes these things a bit more stochastic. As you can see, normally people from around the world. This year, nobody from the US, well, me, but I'm not a student. Always great. Lots of people from Germany, France, Spain. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so there's plenty of feedback, which is great. But it's not, after so many years, it's also not easy to make everybody happy. The best example is temperature. Nobody has a favorite temperature. People want it too hot, people want it too cold. And then there's the usual things where we don't manage to improve, but we always try, right? So I think people enjoyed the social activities. In general, things were okay. I think that there's some notes about the labs that I would like to get into. Okay, so in general, people were happy with the morning talks. I think that there was like a lot of device background, and I think they were very interactive. There was plenty of questions. In general, for the labs, the ratings were positive. There are some notes at the end. I think that there is an intrinsic problem with the school, which is, as you might realize, there's a high variance in the background. So some people know a lot. For some people, some things are super obvious. Some people are more like beginners, and it's very hard to have something that has everybody happy. Having said that, we should think now if there's ways to still improve this, right? In general, I think the feedback was good. There's plenty of things for improving that, again, it might have to do with people that know a bit less, would like to be more kind of directed across the exercises, people that want more modern things might want things that are more interested, or maybe a hackathon. A hackathon is something that every year also comes up, things like this. But it's always hard to make something that has everybody happy, right? So Luckily nowadays we have things like Claude, so it might be easier to rebuild things from scratch. And we're definitely going to think about that. Food is another department where people normally have some points. Portugal has been improving a lot regarding options for vegetarians, I think, and the school is no exception. I think in general, we managed to battle the steep increase in prices. You might have not realized, for example, the banquet was a bit scaled down from what it usually is, but the prices are rising everywhere, and it's always hard to kind of square the budget, right? There's always I think this year there was these people that wanted to have this birthday celebration during the banquet. They came before. I think this was to your satisfaction. Somebody received like a gift during the banquet. I think that went well. We don't do speeches and stuff. We mostly let you do things. If you didn't come with us to Barrio Alto after the banquet, sorry for that. It's not very structured, but the people that went had a lot of fun. So yeah, these things are not, the school is pretty organic, right? You need to kind of move around and kind of try to figure out where you have to go. I think in general, there were not big complaints. I think that the cafeteria was not super crowded. Some years is like really very long lines, and I think this year was okay. So those things are satisfaction. I know that we have some tall people here, and this is probably not as spacious as you would like. It's really hard to fix, I have to say. It's like a plane, you know. What are you going to do? Like remove seats? But we have what we have. Maybe you can sit, if you don't feel too ashamed, which I see on average you are, you can always sit in the front. We don't make hard questions or anything to people in the front. I think monitors, as every year, they're very positive and try to make things positive for everybody, and I think that worked out. The lighting, I think, was okay. Oh, I can see, definitely see everybody. Let's see. So things change. We try to change every year. Audio and speech, for example, is something, normally we have some evening talks that's not multimodal, audio, speech. We don't have right now labs for speech, but we could. We do have vision and multimodal learning, and that's something that has been happening only in the last 3 years, something like this. Now robots are coming in, and soon they will be walking among us, and it would be really cool to have but I think that's probably a bit out of scope. We also hear you about the causality lab. We discussed this. If we have a causality lab, we would have to remove the panel or do something in the middle. That would be weird, but it's something that we can definitely, that should be easy if we decide to do it. It's something that's doable for next year. Again, for the people for which much of the material was already known, they would like to discuss, we had some very interesting topics to discuss when we are outside of the school, right? Between beers, we discussed, for example, this kind of new trend of teacher distillation in reinforcement learning. And I know that some people are very interested in this, and this is the kind of material that having the researchers here are top of the line, right? So you could really have very interesting conversations that might be more adjusted to recent topics. But again, there's this balance of having something for everybody. It's not easy. So in general, maybe we should be more proactive in saying, if you want to talk about things, come to us, come to the speakers. We can always talk and discuss these topics, right? Even if they're not in the labs, we can definitely discuss everything. Okay, so overall, it's great. I think the feedback was great as every year. There's these options of redesigning the labs, which now that we have a robot that can work for hours, is definitely the best change in the last years for sure. This year we were fixing bugs on the fly. You probably didn't realize, but we redid the pictures from the first day to the second day. We redid the pictures of the neural network structure in ticks in 20 minutes, and everything was running again, right? So it's really good that we can do all these changes, and maybe that causes big redesigns in the future. Again, balance of lecture depth is always something that it's intrinsic with this variance problem. Social interaction, I would say there was plenty of it. You also have been, I know that some people are less proactive, but Lisbon is a place that invites social interaction. So I'm very positive that this in general is going to go good. Oh wait, what? Go back to having a free day by the middle. How do you know this? This is very suspicious. Wait a minute. Like, I think somebody has been injecting me suggestions here, right? It's impossible. You cannot know this. This is okay. Who was it? Now I cannot trust any of this, but okay. Anyway, so yeah, and preserve the school stereotype practice approach. So the thing is, we could just put you to do hacking phase, but we don't want to, right? This is a school that's focused on fundamentals. And the issue is, okay, for the problems of today, what are the fundamentals? What should you really think hard about? And that keeps shifting. And the best we can do is try to track it and think from time to time what we have to change. But yeah, that's our mark. We have always been focused on fundamentals, and we are definitely going to keep doing this. It's just that we need to invest the time. Okay, so of course, we need to thank our sponsors, Zendesk and Fidelidade. There's also plenty of partners. Like here, all the organizers are super senior. So, you know, like our time is pretty valuable for the companies or institutions we work for. And that means that they're very generously letting us do these things. And that's definitely something to be appreciated. We wouldn't be anything without our great speakers. They're really, really good. They're friendly. You probably talk with many of them. They add most of the value of the school. Also the panelists. I think that it was. I heard it was interesting, and it didn't go exactly in the direction that was planned, but it was anyway very interesting. These are the monitors. I did part of them. Leon Botu was not a monitor, he's a speaker, but he decided to join. We were happy to have him in there, so he's in all the photos. Of course, thank you for attending, and I hope you have the best time possible. And yeah. Oh yeah, regarding budget, like if you really like the lanyard and the badge, just keep it. But if you want to leave it outside in the boxes we left, that's great. That will help us with also the budget and things. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining. I hope you had a good time, and yes, it's time to go to the airport. Bye-bye.